مع الكلمة الرئيسية في الجلسة الافتتاحية ويلقيها الدكتور بابلو مارتن أثينا، عميد كلية الاقتصاد جامعة الكالا الاسبانية ورئيس جمعية تاريخ الاقتصاد الاسباني، والذي يحدثنا عن اقتصاديات التحول الديمقراطي الاسباني ومراحله من الديكتاتورية إلى الديمقراطية. فليتفضل سيادته بإلقاء كلمته.
Good morning, Excellencies, Mr. Chairman of the Egyptian Cabinet Information and Decision Support, Madam Director of IDSC, Mr. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege and an honor to have been invited to participate in this workshop organized by the Egyptian Cabinet Information and Decision Support Center, the Spanish Embassy, and the Spanish International Agency for Cooperation and Development. I'm delighted to share with you the experience of the Spanish economic transition. And I'd like to thank not only the organizers, but also all of you that have been kind enough to come to this morning to listen to a modest Spanish professor of economics and economic history. When invited, I was asked to tell the Spanish economic transition history, from the dictatorship to a democratic regime. What happened in the economic atmosphere, how politicians and experts faced and dealt with the many difficulties of the time. Many of you are economists, and economics is a dismal science, a boring topic if compared with political, cultural, artistic, and social issues. It deals with scarce resources and how to allocate them to fill our needs and desires, which are infinite, as Lord Robinson said, defining our science. Economists have known an easy job, to tell people they cannot have all what they want, that they have to make choices, to forego alternatives, that they have to accept sacrifices. All this happened in the Spanish political transition period because the process, after 40 years of dictatorship, took place in the middle of a severe crisis that began in 1973 and aggravated in 1979. I have divided the transition period in 4 phases. The first one, from 1977 to 1979, was characterized by consensus. The following one, up to 1982, there was conflict, deep conflict. And the last phase in which the problems and difficulties were surpassed and to some extent solved. What lessons from the Spanish experience, if any, can be drawn? It is one of my tasks. I have come here to tell a story, a part of Spanish economic history, but also, and more important for me, to learn from you, to listen to what you have to teach me, and to learn about the current Egyptian experience. I will tell a very modern history, but then I really like to learn, as I said, from what you have to tell me. I will take 45 minutes of your time, precious time, and I hope what I say will be useful for that will follow in the second part of the workshop. And now let me read what I have prepared for you. Franco died in November 1975, leaving behind a 40 years period of dictatorship And in 1986, Felipe González, the socialist president of an Spanish democratic government, signed in Madrid the country's adherence to the European Economic Community, now European Union. The decade elapsed between both dates has been the most decisive in the recent Spanish modern history. Although this period was characterized by political, social and economic difficulties, the transition from a dictatorship regime to a democratic regime was a success, to which the entire civil society and a group of outstanding personalities have contributed alike. Politicians from the right and from the left of the ideological spectrum, conservatives, liberal, socialists and communists, conscious that attitude of confrontation and radicalism led nowhere, joined forces to assure a swift and peaceful transition. They understood from the beginning that what the large majority of the population wished was freedom and economic progress. After the death of Franco, the Spanish society aspired to larger quotas of political participation, higher standard of living, a more equal distribution of income, a less intervened and controlled economy, and a more competitive, efficient and stable market. However, the new democratic opportunity for the country did not come in a favorable atmosphere, but it came hand in hand with a severe economic crisis that began in 1973 and lasted for almost 10 years. A full decade of crisis that tested the resilience, the intellectual capacity and adaptability of the different social groups. It also challenged the imagination and strength of the political class, because, as asserted by Mr. Fuentes Quintana, a prestigious member of the academia, an economic vice president of the first democratic government, an economy in disarray is a political problem of first magnitude. And because of this, serious economic difficulties require bold and decisive solutions. A deep economic recession may complicate the achievements of a democratic regime if the problems are not faced and solved. The Spanish history of the 20th century is a good example of the interdependence between economic crisis and democratic opportunities. To take advantage of the second necessarily imply to tackle the first challenge. As suggested by the political science literature, the legitimacy and the social force that sustain a democracy is the conviction that a democratic regime is efficient in solving economic, social and political problems. Because if a democratic regime does not find efficient answers, the legitimacy of a democracy may be eroded and may affect its continuity. Time is also an essential element, since the instauration of a democratic regime must proceed fast in the first month of the transition period. Another salient ingredient is the political and technical capacity of its political leadership and the conviction of the political class that democracy is superior to any other political system. Spain's political transition was marked by one of the deepest recessions suffered by the Spanish economy in the 20th century. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 and the price increases in oil and raw materials in 1973 hit unexpectedly all industrial societies, closing a long period of growth and prosperity that had begun after the Second World War. After nearly 2 decades and a half of sustained growth and convinced that industrial nations have discovered the secret of unlimited wealth, the developed world face one more time the unpleasant surprise of economic stagnation, unemployment, and inflation. The crisis hit Spain with a special hardness. In the early 1970s, the Spanish economy showed a considerable welfare gap with respect to the most developed nations of Western Europe. Income per capita was at 25% below the average of the then European common market. Industry, despite its advances during the 60s, was specialized in all branches, with widespread inefficiencies, and strongly depended on imports of intermediate goods and energy. Sheltered under the umbrella of protectionism, a large number of industrial sectors were non-competitive. Interventionism as well was a salient feature of the economy, with wage and price controls, interest rates set by the Ministry of Finance, mobility of capital hampered by regulation, and labour relations regulated also by the government. Moreover, monetary and fiscal policy had been traditionally permissive, and social agents, entrepreneurs and workers and consumers lacked firm convictions about the advantages of macroeconomic stability. After 1973, the rise in oil and raw material prices caused a rapid increase in the cost of production, a fall in private investment, a reduction in exports, and a decline in capital inputs. Final prices skyrocketed. The inflation rate reached 20% in 75 and 40%, record high in the summer of 1977. Unemployment increased with a loss of 215,000 workplaces each semester. The balance of payment and current account deteriorated, and foreign reserve dwindled, while the budget deficit ran uncontrolled. Business benefits were drastically reduced. Commercial and industrial firms closed or went bankrupt. Loans and credit went unpaid, and the level of non-performing assets in financial institutions rose to dangerous levels. In 1978, a banking crisis broke out, and in the following 5 years, half of the banks of the financial system liquidated or had to be rescued. The paralysis of the last governments of the dictatorship also contributed to the gravity of the crisis. Weak and disoriented because of the simultaneity of the crisis and the death of Franco, they did not know how to react to events, neither made a good diagnosis of the crisis, nor took the necessary measures to face the present disequilibria of the economy. In the paper, I now tell the story of a previous economic transition in 1959 that allowed Spain to grow very fast in the 1960s. Because it's in the paper, I will escape that part and I will concentrate on the transition period, if you allow me. In July 1976, King Juan Carlos appointed a new prime minister, president of the government, as we call it, Mr. Adolfo Suarez, to steer a political transition toward democracy, which in the words of Mr. Torcuato Fernández Miranda, president of the Cortes, the Spanish parliament, had to flow from the law to the law. In other words, the new democratic legality had to be constructed without breaking the legality of the dictatorship, a very difficult task. With his natural acumen, Mr. Suarez, a man of exceptional political talent, understood that his task was to dismantle the institutional framework of the Franco regime, and that although it was urgent, he could leave the struggle against inflation and economic imbalances for later. We know today that he was correct, because in less than a year, he created a new political party of the center-right, the Union of the Democratic Center, gained approval for the law for political reform, called the first democratic elections, won them, and formed his second government in July 1977. It was at this point that the president of the government turned his attention to an economy that was in its death throes. He appointed two highly respected public figures with considerable influence, Mr. Enrique Fuentes Quintana and Mr. Francisco Fernández Ordóñez, as Deputy Minister for the Economy, as Deputy Prime Minister for the Economy and Finance Minister, respectively. Upon entering the government, Mr. Fuentes tried to convince Mr. Suarez of the urgent need to deal with the economy, if the aspiration and expectations created by democratic freedom were not to be frustrated. Mr. Fuentes himself has written that he discussed a plan to restructure the economy with the president after the elections, although the latter was still unable to consider his request until September. The deputy minister and his team and those in charge of the Bank of Spain kept on working because they considered essential to make the problem of economic imbalances an absolute priority on the government's political agenda. They also believe that remedying the imbalances would involve a thorough diagnosis of the causes and a comprehensive program of economic policy measures. President Suarez took 2 months to make a decision. Now it seems, it was at the time a very long time. Now it seems, a very short time, just 2 months in a transition period. But we thought it was a very long time at the time. And Mr. Fuentes has countless meetings with the president to persuade him to address the problems of the economy as a matter of urgency. Mr. Fuentes succeeded in his mission and convinced Suarez, the president, who also decided to seek an agreement with the main political forces and representative of the employers and the trade union, if possible. During those 2 months of impasse, there were countless meetings at the Ministry of Finance, and they prepared a document entitled Economic Restructuring and Reform Program. The document listed the imbalances of the Spanish economy and expressed the unanimous opinion among Spanish economists about the seriousness of the situation. There was agreement on the causes of the crisis and its consequences, as well as on the measures that needed to be taken. The solution, they agree, did not lie in protectionism or in isolation from the world economy or in greater state intervention. Moreover, the problems were also acknowledged as being both cyclical and structural. The former required fiscal and monetary measures, and the latter needed reforms in the productive structure, the tax system, the financial system, the framework of labor relations, and of how the state and public enterprises were to be run. After the document was completed, it was sent to the members of the cabinet. At first, opinion differed as to the advisability of the program and the procedure that should be followed. Within the government and the ruling party, there were those who supported submitting a reform plan directly to the Cortes, Spanish Parliament. Others, on the contrary, advocated sending the document to all social partners, the employers, organizers, and the trade union, and leaving the agreement to them. In the end, however, the government decided to lead the economic restructuring and reform process and approved the document, sending it to all political parties with parliamentary representation. The program was the subject of an intense debate over 2 intense days in early October 1977, at the Palace of Moncloa, the Prime Minister official residence. Those working sessions and discussion highlighted the fact that despite the significant ideological differences between those participating, they all agree on the diagnosis, the severity of the economic situation, and on the remedies proposed by the governments in the government's program. A twofold agreement was therefore reached. First, the urgent need to undertake an action plan against inflation and external imbalances. And second, on the need for structural reforms to modernize the productive apparatus. The agreement also contained an acceptance by all political parties of the general framework within which the Spanish economy would operate in the future, and that was crucial. The market as a mechanism for allocation and distribution of resources, free enterprise, and respect for private property. The agreement were embodied in the so-called Moncloa Agreement, which was signed October 77. 2 days later, the Congress of Deputies passed the economic plan that had been negotiated in the Moncloa Pact with one only dissenting vote. According to Charles Power, who was with here a few months ago, the agreement originality lay in the fact that in return for accepting the restructuring measure proposed by the government, the opposition demanded the inclusion of a major package of reform aimed at dismantling the corporate institution of the previous regime and incorporating the social partners in the decision-making process. What did the Moncloa Agreement contain? On what technical cornerstones were they based? The program's primary objective was the adjustment of the economy in order to correct its imbalances, inflation and the current account balance of payment deficit. It was based on the belief that inflation is of no benefit to society and on the contrary is the root cause of all economic and social ills. No country has succeeded in improving its situation in a crisis with a rising rate of inflation. The fight against inflation was therefore a question of survival. The measure for action in the plan included the implementation of a policy to control the money supply, the adoption of a budgetary policy aimed at limiting the public deficit, the establishment of a realistic exchange rate for the peseta, the previous Spanish currency before the euro was adopted, the establishment of an income policy based on two pillars, wage increases in line with anticipated inflation, not based on historical rate, and a reduction in social security contributions based on payroll. As well as these measures, the battery of reform agreed in the Moncloa Agreement were truly ambitious and addressed many of the outstanding problems of the Spanish economy: to modernize the tax system, to liberalize the financial system and open it up to competition, increasing the Bank of Spain capacity for control and supervision, to define a new framework for labor relations, and reforming the scope and action of the public companies. The Moncloa Pact was a great success from the political point of view, as they show the possibilities for collaboration between the various parties to remedy the economic imbalances. The agreement marked a dramatic change in the attitudes towards dealing with problems. They paved the way for an active monetary policy to fight inflation. They allow progress to be made in the reform of the financial system. They led to compromises to curb wage increases. They facilitated the correction of the external deficit by severe devaluation. They provided the impetus for an extensive tax reform focused on direct taxation. and they provided the outline for other reforms aimed at deregulation and market flexibility. The pact was born out of political consensus and showed that the severity of the situation required each social group to assume its own responsibilities. The situation was hopeless if all Spain's citizens simultaneously demanded their rights without assuming their responsibilities. Analysts maintain that the Moncloa agreements ran their positive course through two channels. One, the effectiveness of their measures to correct the imbalances and the climate of trust created between the social partners. According to Mr. Fuentes, thanks to it, the political support they received from the entire political spectrum, employers and organizations, trade unions, accepted the adjustment program, and society looked towards the economic and political future with more optimism. This favorable atmosphere made possible the democratic constitution of December 1978 without the trauma of a chaotic destabilization. But with the approval of the referendum, our consensus ended. It is true that the most complicated phase of the transition to democracy was finished with undeniable success. The second free election were held in February 1979. Mr. Adolfo Suárez formed a new government with Mr. Fernando Abril Martorell as Deputy Prime Minister for the economy. One period was ending, while another one that was equally complex was beginning, holding even greater challenges than those that had already been mentioned. According to Mr. Powell, that I quote again, the list of challenges included the creation of the state of the autonomous regions, the assimilation of the political changes by the armed forces, the development of a new social employment framework, and the elimination of terrorism that was hitting the country very hardly, as Mr. Ambassador has just mentioned before. And if this was not enough, the economy barely gave the political class any respite, as another economic crisis began in 1979, which was more intense and damaging than the previous one, if that was possible. Furthermore, the parliamentary climate deteriorated after the elections. According to the socialists, the consensus was destined for the archives of history, which the Center Democratic Party did not deny. Mr. Suárez himself, the president, in his inaugural address as president of the first constitutional government said, "The consensus is over." According to another political scientist, Santos Juliá, after the constitution was approved and an initial agreement to build the framework of the state of the autonomous region was reached, it was necessary to implement party politics and not, as previously, the policy of a non-existent government of national unity. Consensus gave way to conflict, although it is true that the breakdown of the political consensus did not interfere with what needed to be done in the field of economics, and nor did it affect the pillars of which the functioning of the economy was based. Political consensus was broken, but not economic consensus on the main. As noted above, despite their immediate beneficial effects, the Moncloa Agreement only provided a short period of calm, as the economic climate changed abruptly as a result of this Iranian Islamic Revolution in January 1979, and the simultaneous decision by the OPEC to raise oil prices for the second time in June. The result was a sudden deterioration in the situation at the start of a deep depression in the OECD countries, accompanied by renewed inflationary pressures. The plans of the newly installed Center Democratic government were disrupted, and it was necessary to design a new strategy to deal with the situation. In fact, the economic history of the years from 79 to 82 was essentially the story of an economic policy which attempted to deal with a continuing deterioration of economic conditions, of which the destruction of employment was the most painful consequence. Let me make a break to drink some water. Well, if I can. Here it is true. It's always difficult.
Spanish break.
A Spanish break, right. It's not a siesta, eh? It's just a short break. Well, after this short Spanish siesta, let me continue. In the summer 1979, the government, without consulting the opposition on this occasion, developed an economic program for the medium term and reflected the pessimism with which it viewed the situation. Mr. Abril Martorell, the new Deputy Prime Minister for the Economy, refused to conceal the bleak outlook for Spain, which, like that of the OECD countries, anticipated a deep recession and a strong inflationary pressure. The stark reality is mentioned in one paragraph of the plan. Society has to understand, and the government must insist, that the rising prices of crude oil imposed a real impoverishment on the importing countries, which take the form of a transfer of resources to the exporting countries, and all this leads to a reduction in real disposable income for all Spaniards. The team in charge of the Bank of Spain expressed equal pessimism in the report of 1979, in which they pointed out that the result achieved with a painful adjustment since 1977 have largely evaporated, and the global economy is once again faced with serious problems that require further adaptations. Pessimism was therefore widespread, and by late autumn it seemed that the adoption of an economic policy designed to tighten the screws on the adjustment mechanism was inevitable. At the end of 1980, President Suarez himself reiterated the need to implement a policy of adjustment to change the trend of the economic situation, but also acknowledged the difficulties of overcoming the crisis given the unfavorable international and economic climate. Mr. Abril Martorell and his team were courageous enough to have faced up to the economic situation, and at the time to promote economic reforms, the economic reform the country needed. He was responsible for legislation at a frantic rate between 79 and 82, which it is overwhelming even to list today. In February 1980, the Interfederal Framework Agreement was signed between the employers' organization and the Socialist Trade Union. The Workers' Statute came into effect in March. The National Energy Plan, the Organic Law for financing the autonomous regions, and a Basic Law for employment. The Vice President, on the other hand, entrusted the Bank of Spain with a fight against inflation, which included responsibility for the exchange rate and interest rate. and he also entrusted the bank with finding a convoluted banking crisis which affected 3/4 of the system and ended with the closure of half of the banking institution that had existed in 1977. The Bank of Spain was successful in both of these areas. It prevented prices from running out of control and avoided the breakdown of the financial system. But the economy was not the only problem of the Center Democratic Union Party had to deal with. It suffered the constant harassment from the opposition, notably the Spanish socialist workers, the trade union, and also the employers' organization, not to mention the internal divisions within the party itself. The debate on the motion of censure presented by the socialists took place in May 1980, and in June the employers' organization announced a plan entitled Urgent Measures to Combat Unemployment that contained strong criticism of the government's economic policy with regard, especially with regard to taxation, social security and labor relations. The erosion of the government popularity was so swift that Mr. Martorell, the man responsible for economic policy since the Moncloa Agreement, resigned. This was a political setback for Mr. Suarez and led to serious doubts about the continuation of the adjustment and reform plan. However, the adjustment, despite changes within the government, continued, with Mr. Leopoldo Calvo Sotelo and Deputy Prime Minister. The Bank of Spain tightened its control over monetary policy, reinforcing its plan against inflation. The process of reform and liberalization of the financial system went ahead, and a tax reform introduced with new texts on direct taxation and the introduction of the value-add tax. The National Energy Plan was revised and further steps were taken to liberalize the labor market and so on and so forth. However, the situation was complicated, and eventually, as you know, President Suarez resigned in the month of January, and it was a coup attempt, the well-known coup attempt of the 23 February 91. As a result, Suarez left the government and Mr. Calvo Sotelo took over. And now again, the consolidation of democracy and the defense of the Constitution became the main political priority. And Mr. Calvo Sotelo announced the possibility of coming back to a new political consensus with the trade unions, employers, and the parliamentary opposition. Well, things really did not improve. In 1982, the economy still was with difficulties. It deteriorated, and by then, 82, was then clear that the solution to the economic crisis required further sacrifices and a new political force, supported by a broad majority of society, which would implement a plan of restructuring and reforming, which had to be as aggressive as the one attempted in 1977. And then comes the last phase of the transition that was commanded and under the rule of the new majority that the Socialist Party won after the elections of 82. And when they came to power, the economy remained at the heart of the political agenda, of course. The Socialists produced a comprehensive program that contained everything they had been accumulating under the vague but effective concept of change. They progressed to create a job, to
to modernize the economy, to help small and medium enterprise, to restructure the public enterprises, and to combat the tax fraud. They also propose to create a more just and unequal society and to modernize the economic apparatus. However, they had to establish also priorities. And again, the socialists, with Mr. Miguel Boyer as Minister of the Economy and Mr. Carlos Solchaga as Ministry of Industry, they agree that macroeconomic stability was an entire priority. The fight against inflation again became the #1 target, and the main macroeconomic instruments were focused towards that end. It is true that at the same time, and then they implemented the tax macroeconomic policy measure that had been introduced and approved in the period of consensus. At the same time, however, it is true that Mr. Carlos Solchaga was able to implement a program for the reindustrialization of the economy in order to revitalize the industrial sector. The new industrial policy that was to be implemented by the ministry focused not only on restructuring financial liabilities and surplus labor at companies in difficulties, as had been the case until that point, but also on tackling the conversion of industrial assets and a reorientation of productive resources towards areas with future potential. That is, Mr. Miguel Boyer focused on macroeconomic stability and making inflation and the correction of external imbalances the priority, while Mr. Carlos Solchaga attempted to introduce the more the structural reform needed in the industrial sector. Therefore, it was a combination of adjustment, structural reform, and industrial restructuring. But the socialists maintain the three basic pillars that they had agreed on the Moncloa Pact. So the consensus has been broken, but not entirely, or at least not in the economic sphere, because the market economy, private initiative, and private property were also the basis on which the economic policy of the socialists were implemented. Well, the economy began to recover in 83, 86, and it continued. An explanation of the factors behind the recovery included what we can call the macroeconomic stabilization, with reduction in inflation, the reduction in the budget deficit, which was achieved by tax increases and cuts in public expenditure, the traditional and the standard measures, new exchange rate devaluations to promote exports and to reduce the external deficit and the external imbalances, and at the same time, because the socialists had a very large majority in the first government that they formed, they were able to approve important economic reform, a new tax system. They introduced law to restructure the industrial sector and also to keep liberalizing the financial sector. Of course, an ingredient that must not be concealed to explain the Spanish economy during these 3-4 years is the recovery of the international economy itself, what one can be named as the EEC effect. The US and the European economy began to grow fast. in the mid-1980s, and so the Spanish economy benefited from this expansionary cycle. Well, let me finish with what lessons, if any, can be obtained from the Spanish experience. I have listed some of them. Perhaps some others can be added. Perhaps some other can be discussed, and I'm sure you can enlighten me with your own views and interpretation of what happened in this long period, 1 decade of transition, in which different phases can be distinguished. The lesson from the Spanish experience, well, there was always consensus on the economic sphere. There was not always consensus on the political arena. With 2 years of consensus, the rest was conflict. In fact, opposing with opposing alternatives. But on the economic spheres, macroeconomic stabilization was a priority for everybody, no matter who was in the government. Everybody understood that an economy cannot progress, cannot grow with imbalances, inflation, external deficit, budget deficit, and so on and so forth. That was understood by the center-right party, the conservative, the liberal, the communist, the socialist, and so on and so forth. And of course there was a consensus on the structural reform that the country needed. The tax system, the liberalization of the financial system, a new framework for market, for labor relations, swift changes, drastic changes, in fact, in the industrial sector. Another lesson is that there were permanent negotiations, not on the political area, also in the political area in the first phase of the transition, but basically the economic agents, trade unions, entrepreneurs organizations, political parties with parliamentary representation, they were negotiating permanently. So perseverance in those negotiations, despite the fact that sometimes the agreements were difficult to reach. There was, of course, consensus on the diagnosis and the solutions within the ministries of the economy and finance and the Bank of Spain. Experts, economic experts, in the academia and in the government and in the independent agency, all, curiously enough, saw things through the same eyes. And in fact, they coincided on the diagnosis. Something that is not happening today, for instance. It was in a special period. It was in a particular time in which we found this consensus on the causes and the consequences of the crisis. And of course, there was also consensus on the pillars of the economy, despite the political conflict. These pillars were included in the Constitution, but they were reached before the Constitution, 2 years or 1 year and a half before the Constitution. The market economy, the Spanish economy was defined as an open market economy, as the mechanism to allocate and distribute resources that are scarce, as we know. Secondly, private property, security for private property, respect for private property, and third, the private initiative, private enterprise as pillar of the functioning of the economy. And it is not written here, but I now like to use the word before mentioned by the director of the president of the IDLC, perseverance. Perseverance. There was perseverance in 10 years, perseverance in one objective, to make the political transition. And in order to obtain that objective, economists and experts also made a consensus that now that we see it, after so many years that had passed, as something, I wouldn't say miraculous, I just would say there was, as I said before, politicians, society from all the ideological spectrum consider essential, and they put away for a time their ideological differences in order to make a deal. Thank you very much for your attention.